My name is Alex Saleh, and I'm the managing partner of GLA & Company, a leading Arab civil law firm in the Middle East with a strong presence across the GCC and Egypt. We're about 150 lawyers across the 6 jurisdictions of Kuwait, Saudi, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, which is today's focus, and Egypt. Today, and it's an honor to moderate today's panel discussion, particularly as we delve into a vital topic of foreign investment and business operations in the unkept secret of Qatar. At GLA, we represent numerous multinationals that are eager to invest and expand their operations in the MENA region. A lot of times these companies come to us and they have the same common questions and whatnot when they're looking at a jurisdiction. For example, they want to know, is it possible to be 100% foreign owned in that particular jurisdiction? What are the foreign direct investment restrictions? How straightforward is it to secure the necessary licenses and approvals to commence operations? What's the tax landscape like? What's the talent situation there, whether with citizens or expats? Or how easy is it to bring in foreign talent into the country when you have a wonderful project you want to implement? They also ask when things go sour, how robust is the legal system in ensuring a positive regulatory environment? In the event of the disputes between parties, with respect to your contracts, how efficient, how independent is judiciary in that jurisdiction? As someone who's spent over 30 years in the GCC, I can confidently say that the region has undergone a remarkable transformation. I always tell everyone, when I first came, we had 3 laws in each country, a civil law, a commercial law, and a company's law, and that was it. When I see how these jurisdictions, including Qatar, have grown up over the last 30 years and become modern legal systems, it's amazing. So, you know, and I think in Qatar in particular, there's so much opportunities there for a lot of groups that are looking to get into various lines of business. And our office there is definitely in a position to help. Qatar stands out as a beacon of opportunity for many reasons. It's one of the largest LNG producers in the world, providing a strong foundations for its economy and attracting significant foreign investment. It's also positioned itself well as a diplomatic hub, hosting various international groups and fostering dialogue to resolve global disputes. Moreover, it's really established itself well as a destination for sporting events, showcasing its modern infrastructure and commitment to excellence. Today, we're fortunate to have a nice distinguished panel with us, including experts from GLA & Company and an amazing representative from the Qatar International Court and Disputes Resolution Center. I look forward to hearing their insights on these pressing issues as we explore Qatar's current foreign direct investment regime, the evolving landscape of merger control, and the implications of Qatarization. Specifically, we have 4 speakers with us today. First, we have Mr. Omar Azma. He's the registrar for the Qatar International Court and Dispute Resolution Center. Prior to taking his role, he's practiced first as a barrister, later cross-qualifying as a solicitor at a large international firm. Omar has also practiced within the government, working for the Attorney General of England and Wales. Most importantly, and very impressive, Omar has undertaken a doctorate at the University of Oxford. We also have some of our GLA team members with us today. We have Dean Jaloudi, who's the head of our Qatar office, joined by Mr. Asad Ahmed, who heads up our antitrust and competition practice across the region, and increasingly been involved in merger control issues in Qatar itself. And we also have Jihan Sola, who's going to be presenting on some labor issues. Without further ado, we'd love to introduce Omar.
Thank you for that very generous invitation, and thank you to GLA for hooking me up with this great opportunity to speak to all of you and everybody who's here. I think we've got pretty good turnout, so thank you for all joining us. What I was going to talk about briefly is the special economic zones in Qatar. Now, I'm not sure how many of you know in detail about these, but effectively, Qatar decided, as many countries blessed with natural resources, it decided to create some special economic zones to try and diversify its economy. Now, what do I mean by that? These zones are created with special business conditions in order to attract regional and foreign direct investment. There are 4 at the moment: the Qatar Financial Center, which is the largest one, the Qatar Free Zones Authority, there's a media city, and there's also a science and technology park. Now, what are the incentives for people investing in these zones? Well, taking the Qatar Financial Center as a primary example, as it's the biggest one, ownership structures, as was just mentioned in the introduction. You can own the company 100% as a foreigner. That's quite important, of course. You can repatriate 100% of your profits. The tax regime, corporation tax is low. It's around 9.5% at the moment. The registration fees are reasonably modest. And the business development team and the assistance that people get from the financial center itself is very, very good with relationship managers. They're very responsive and they're very happy to help. Now, where do we come in? The Qatar International Court and Dispute Resolution Center. So we are effectively part of the offering that the special economic zones make to investors. If something goes wrong, as was mentioned in the introduction, you can come to us. Now, a brief bit about the Qatar International Court and Dispute Resolution Center. It's QIC DRC for short. It's a bit of a mouthful. That's effectively our brand name. So what we have is a court, a civil and commercial court. We have a regulatory tribunal. We have arbitration and mediation services. Now, focusing on the court first and foremost. Why is it good to use us? What do we do? So first and foremost, we are a dual language court. That's very, very important. People are entitled to plead either in English or in Arabic. Now, we are a court of the state of Qatar, so there is no onshore and offshore distinction. And those of you familiar with these regimes will know automatically that an onshore regime has greater prospects for enforcement. We can in-house enforce our own judgments through the state system. So we don't have to go to another court with a judgment which may or may not be treated slightly differently. We are a state court, and that's very clearly written into our rules. The judiciary is another very, very strong part of our offering. So we have judges uniquely from both civil and common law countries. The civil law judges actually straddle different civil law traditions. We have a judge from France. We have 3 judges from Qatar. We have a judge who is from China as well. So we cover both bases, which is quite unique, and it's important because, of course, we are in a general civil law jurisdiction. So we are of the view it's critically important to have civil law judges as well as common law judges. Expertise is critical as well. The president of our court is Lord Thomas, who's the former Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales. However, that very high bar extends across all of our judges. Our judge from America was the former IMF General Counsel, for example. Our Indian judge is a former Solicitor General of India. Our Chinese judge, a former Supreme Court judge of that country. We've got the former Chief Justice of the Federal Court of Australia. Our judges are usually either very senior, very eminent practitioners or very retired judges. So that's another big tick. Speed. We get our cases through quickly. We have a policy of proactive case management. Our small claims cases, so those are worth about $27,000 US or less, get through from the case being issued to the judgment being handed down in English and in Arabic in about 30 days. Our non-small claims cases take around 46 days where there's not a hearing, and our full cases with trials and witnesses, disclosure, bundles, chronologies, they will take roughly 6 months to get through from start to finish. So our times are enviable. We're a transparent court as well. All of our proceedings are broadcast live on our website. There's about a 30-second lag. Now, where there is a need for privacy, for example, in an arbitration case, of course, that is kept private, but pretty much everything else is broadcast live. Parties can, if they wish, apply to have the hearing not broadcast live. But since I've joined, we've had roughly 60% of our caseload from October 22 to today. We've not once granted one of those applications because, of course, open justice is a very, very important principle, as you'll all know. The lawyers are another great asset for us. We have lawyers like our judges from around the world. And what is a great advantage to us is that any lawyer qualified to appear before the higher courts of any jurisdiction can come and represent parties before our court. There's no registration, there's no certification, there are no fees, all are welcome. And again, that is written into our rules. There's 2 more points I wanted to make. First of all, jurisdiction. One of the key points is that we are not an opt-in jurisdiction. Broadly speaking, there has to be a link with one of the special economic zones in order for us to have a hook for jurisdiction. So, for example, 2 companies within the Qatar Financial Center in a dispute can come to us. one party within the Qatar Financial Center and another party either in the state or outside the country, that would come to us. An employee suing an employer or a former employer, that would...
You're on mute, Omar.
Forgive me. If the authorities of the special economic zones are being sued, that can also come to us. But the key point to emphasize is we are not an opt-in jurisdiction. If there's no link, then we can't take the case, apart from in arbitration cases, where we can act as a supervisory or competent court for any Qatar-seated arbitration. We have seen significant growth in the last 2.5 to 3 years. We're now, by a margin, the second busiest international commercial court of our kind in the world. So we're growing quite rapidly. And with that growth is coming a lot of other opportunities for us. So we've just launched a legal clinic, which is the first of its kind in the jurisdiction, whereby anybody with a Qatar ID or a Qatari registered company can come if they can't afford legal advice, and we will put them in touch with panel law firms. We publish a biannual magazine called the Case Digest, which summarizes the main cases of the widest application in the preceding 6 months. We've brought a book out on the law and practice and procedure of the court and the regulatory tribunal. So we do quite a lot of outreach. We do a lot of work with universities. We have a vibrant internship program. So that's all I really wanted to say. But to recap, effectively, you're going to hear a lot more about the investment environment in Qatar. But if one is considering investing in the state, I would urge you to look at the special economic zones and see if they fit in with your, or if you're the lawyers, your clients' preferences. We are a very, very safe pair of hands. You know, you mentioned judicial independence. Our judges all come from a very, very strong judicial background, whether that's here or across the world. They're very, very independent, and they deal with cases swiftly and justly. So that's all I had to say, just in a nutshell, because I suspect there are many, many other points of view that need to be heard. But thank you for having me.
No, that was wonderful, Omar. And, you know, for me, listening to you talk, I see 3 points that always come up on our potential disputes. One is a lot of our large English documentation, our 500-page and pound documents FIDIC for major contracts that has, you know, so many schedules, our detailed LMA documentation, our detailed shareholder agreements and SPAs on M&A. So whether it's M&A, whether it's banking, whether it's projects, throughout the region, whether it's Saudi civil law, Kuwait civil law, you know, a lot of times you're seeing local Arab civil law, but it's, you know, it has to be litigated. The problem is we don't want necessarily to arbitrate in London in the US. The parties want to do it here. We want Arab civil law because there's always a connection. But, you know, the documentation is in English. So being able to litigate in English is for us a major win. The second is, you know, they're always saying, well, you know, what about fairness? What about, you know, independence? The way you explain the global background of a lot of the higher court judges there is amazing. That's something that would give me comfort, quite honestly, when I hear that. And then when you hear about their backgrounds and their expertise, you know, I need, you know, when I'm advising someone on these large detailed English documents, but it has Arab civil law, I need someone that can do both, that understands the Arab civil law, but can understand the complexities of large English language documentation. And it seems like it's a good fit for that.
It is. I mean, responding to your points in reverse sequential order, we, until last October, we had to sit in panels of 3. So you'd have an Arabic speaker, you'd have an English, and, you know, 2 Arabic speakers and an English speaker. But we're particularly cognizant of the fact that, of course, some of these cases, as you've mentioned, require cross-jurisdictional, cross-language expertise. And, you know, we definitely have that because we've got expert lawyers who are civil trained in the Arab world or in China or in France, and they can be partnered with an English lawyer who is fully familiar with the English law principles of your contract, for example. Secondly, on fairness and openness and transparency, we've issued a practice direction recently to increase transparency, which allows non-parties to cases to apply for documentation in cases that are in front of the court. So if you hear an argument that's particularly interesting, you want to read the skeleton argument, you can write into us under the practice direction and say, please, can you send me that document? And what's important about our judges as well is because they've all got international profiles, you can look them up. You can read all their judgments, you can see their record, you can look at their interviews they've given, for example. And so you'll have that automatic level of confidence that people dealing with your case if something goes wrong are dealing with it to the very, very highest international standards. And very quickly, finally, on language, you're absolutely right. I should also mention that, of course, as we are a dual language court, Arabic and English, we will translate pleadings and important documents for free, because we have to offer both languages for fairness to everybody participating.
That's interesting, because a lot of my fights in the courts are whose Arabic translation is correct. Because I can assure you, my Arabic translation is going to look a lot different than my opponent's. Oh, good to know. Good to know. Wonderful. Well, changing gears. Before we get into, we started with the bitter part. Let's start with the romance, when parties are looking to partner up and come into a jurisdiction, the pretty part of a relationship. Dean, you're the head of the Qatar office, and let's be honest, when a new multinational big project company is looking into coming into Qatar, the first thing they say, can I be 100% foreign owned? Tell me about your FDI, your foreign direct investment regime there now, and what do you have to offer? How do you respond because this is usually one of the initial introductions when a big company is looking at, or medium-sized company is looking to enter into a jurisdiction like Qatar?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the reasons that we wanted to have this webinar in the first place, because there are definitely developments in this space. I see that some of our attendees are in country, but most are not. So I do apologize. I'm going to give a little bit of context here. So the people that are familiar with this jurisdiction, just bear with me. Let me give the context for our non-Qatari resident attendees. So basically, for a very long time, Qatar was similar to other GCC jurisdictions and many other jurisdictions around the world, in that a major restriction was this 5149 requirement that local companies be majority owned ultimately by citizens. This was the system for a while, but then in 2019, the Foreign Investment Law very much liberalized it, opened it up for foreign investment, similar to other countries in the region which have done the same in the past decade. So now there are many commercial activities which are open to 100% foreign investment. There is still a list of activities that are restricted either to 51% or 100% or some other percent Qatari ownership. And this is one of the things that interested parties should keep an eye on, because it's not just the 2019 law that is relevant here. The Ministry of Commerce actually regularly issues an updated list. So the most recent one came out a few months ago. And again, it's following this trend of opening up the country to foreign investment. Our esteemed guest, Omar, briefly discussed the different jurisdictions within the country, just to give a little bit more detail on those. So in addition to the sort of standard mainland ministry system, you have the other special jurisdictions. Qatar Financial Center, of course, probably being the most well-known. That is a mainland, that's an onshore jurisdiction. It's not an offshore jurisdiction. So the distinction there is that QFC companies can practice throughout the country. The key limitation, however, is that the QFC generally licenses non-physical activities. So initially financial services companies, and then those that support the financial services, consulting, management, legal, accounting, auditing, et cetera, et cetera. A few more categories, but that's basically the main limitation to being a QFC company. You can't practice things like construction and general trading and other sort of physical activities. The most recent jurisdiction is Media City Qatar, which, as the name indicates, is focused on licensing media companies. It's really taking off. I see that they're registering, new companies every week. Qatar is well known, obviously, for being the home of Al Jazeera and other, prominent media organizations. So that's another space that is quickly developing in this country. The other two jurisdictions to mention are the Qatar Free Zones, which is a sort of traditional free zone, focused on airport, seaport, maritime, shipping, logistics types of companies. And then finally, there's the Qatar Science and Technology Park, or the QSTP, which again is focused on science and technology companies. And there are some very prominent names that are incorporated there, like Microsoft and I believe Google and a few other both global and also local technology startup companies. So the government has been very much incentivizing foreign direct investment in recent years, in addition to expanding the list of permitted activities and creating new special jurisdictions that investors can register in. The Ministry of Commerce is also doing things like slashing government fees. So some of the standard government fees, like a license application fee or a license renewal fee and all other kinds of government fees, some of those have been slashed by up to 90%. So if it used to cost $3,000 per year to renew your company's license, that might be as low as $300 a year. So very, very investor-friendly environment. And a few other things worth noting for people who are less familiar. Just very briefly on the sort of tax regime of Qatar. Again, very business-friendly. It's not a tax-free jurisdiction, as some people wrongly assume, but it is a low tax and a relatively simple tax regime. So foreign investors would generally be subject to around 10% corporate income tax. It can get a little bit more complicated. I see that we have some people on this webinar representing the Big Four. When it gets a little bit more complicated, then of course those people can advise. But that's generally the situation. In terms of VAT, value-added tax, still not in effect. People have been expecting it to come through for sometime soon for the last few years. As of now, we still don't know when exactly, but the general consensus is that it would be maybe 5% across the board for most items. So again, very reasonable. And then finally, the last thing I would mention here is that even this general restriction, this 51.49% restriction that still applies to some, very critical commercial activities, still applies to a lot of things in sort of banking and finance, insurance, some types of oil and gas services activities, which obviously are, very interesting in a country that is so energy rich. Those restrictions, I don't think, should be disqualifying for foreign investors who are interested in pursuing those activities in this country and getting started. There are many ways to sort of work within those restrictions, but still achieve a mutually acceptable arrangement with your local Qatari partners if for the activities where you would need one. So unfortunately, what happened in the past is that in this jurisdiction, like many others around the region, sometimes people were too aggressive and they didn't properly structure their arrangements with their local partners. Sometimes this can run afoul of different laws, including proxy law, concealment law, tax law, companies law. So our word of caution would be to foreign investors who are interested in some of these activities that are still subject to the 5149 restriction is it would be wise to engage qualified legal counsel to make sure that you're organizing your affairs in a compliant and also mutually beneficial way.
Okay. That's very interesting, Dean, because, looking at it from a macro level across the entire Gulf, what I saw before is, yes, the 5149 foreign ownership restriction, or you did business through an agent. So effectively, for most foreign companies doing business there, they didn't either have control of their business because it was being done through an agent, or they were a minority owner, which meant they didn't have full control over their company. But it was a fair trade, and I think it was necessary from a public policy standpoint of the GCC countries, because the goal was to incentivize and to promote local merchant families and so forth to be involved in business across the region. And we saw that happen.
Well, on that same theme, Alex, I guess what my colleagues Asad and Jihan will cover in their segments is the fact that Qatar again is following the trends of other highly developed countries around the region, which is that some restrictions are coming down, but then some other regulatory requirements, be it data protection, tax, labor law, competition law, those are becoming a little bit more regulated to, again, fall into line with best practices internationally.
And it seems like it's a fair trade-off. Okay, instead of a foreign company needing an agent or 51%, they can be 100% owned. But the fair thing is, in exchange for having complete liberty of their business, there should be a fair corporate income tax. I think you mentioned 10%. And there should be some type of system, and I think Jehan will discuss it, of Qatarization. So, you generate revenue for the governments, fair but not obscene, and have employment opportunities for the local citizens. I think it's a fair trade-off. And what we've seen in other jurisdictions, because of these changes, companies that previously had an agent, a distributor, 51% owner that was more of a sleeping partner, we've seen a ton of restructuring work where not only because the laws allow it, because a lot of the world now is more comfortable dealing in the Gulf and setting up operations. They feel comfortable setting up shop in Saudi, Kuwait, and Qatar, and it requires a restructuring of the business to get there. And we've seen a lot of that, and I'm sure that's happening in Qatar as well as these laws liberalize on the FDI side.
Absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. Well, turning to Mr. Asad Ahmed. Asad, I used to tell people when we were working on global SPAs, and they'd have the merger control section, and they'd say, what are the issues in the Gulf? I go, there are no issues. Let's just do the deal, and we'd close. Now, in the last few years, the last 5 years plus, I know the firm is doing a ton of filings, merger control filings in places like Kuwait and Saudi and now Egypt. What's happening in Qatar with respect to merger control?
Yeah, thank you, Alex, and thank you everyone for joining our webinar. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. That's very true. Starting with Saudi, the trend kind of took off in 2019, and then Kuwait came online in 2020. Egypt just came online as well. UAE with big changes to their financial thresholds, and we're still waiting on their executive regulations there to come online. Now, Qatar's law is a 2006 law, but we do anticipate some changes by the end of this year, or perhaps the beginning of next year, just based off of the trend in the region. My objective in the next few minutes is just to provide you with a general overview of the current competition regime and practice, as well as my practical recommendations for transactions that would fall within the Qatari competition law, and lastly, my predictions for upcoming changes. Now, as I said, the law is a 2006 law, and it's law number 19 of 2006, governing competition and prevention of monopolistic practices, as well as their executive regulations for the law under Ministry Resolution 61 of 2008. The enforcement of the merger control regime is overseen by the Protect Competition and Prevent Monopolistic Practices Committee. The Competition Committee sits within the Qatar Ministry of Commerce and Industry. However, I do anticipate that changing as well. We have a great relationship with the committee, and we regularly speak with them regarding their current practices in applying the Qatar competition regime. We've also approached them for informal, no-name basis consultations on potential filings. The committee is very responsive. They are very pro-business, and unlike other jurisdictions, and please listen to this, there are no merger control filing fees. Okay, take advantage of that while you can. The regulator is not as active as the GCC jurisdictions. However, I do also anticipate a change in that fairly soon. Now, when we're talking about merger control filings, the main concept to see if a transaction triggers a filing is two elements, basically: whether the economic concentration definition is met, so the transaction falls within the scope of economic concentration, and do the parties meet the relevant thresholds, right? Now, Qatar is a little bit unique. Currently, the competition law doesn't use the term economic concentration, which we all know very well. However, it applies the same general concept under the competition law. As such, the following transactions would fall within the scope of the Qatar competition law, which is acquiring assets, acquiring ownership rights or use first rights, buying stocks, which is a little bit unique there as well, and creating consortiums or mergers or to combine management of two or more corporate persons. And obviously within that concept, that would encompass joint ventures. There's no distinction between full function and non-full function joint ventures under the current competition law. Now, assuming a transaction actually falls within the definition of economic concentration, now we move on to, hey, does it meet the relevant thresholds? Typically, competition laws would have either market share thresholds, or they would have financial thresholds, which are suitable for their markets. Now, these thresholds would change from time to time, reflecting the state of the local markets. However, the current Qatar competition regime does not have either of these thresholds. It's very unique in this aspect, and rather than a threshold, rather that the threshold is met in the event an economic concentration results in the creation or strengthening of a dominant position in the market. So they decided that that was going to be the standard, which is obviously very subjective in nature. And neither the law nor the executive regs provide for any objective criteria by which to assess if the standard has been reached, right? However, throughout our conversations with the committee, it seems that one of the criteria they utilize is the market share of the parties involved in the transaction, and which makes sense in terms of if there's a dominant position in the market, you would have to have a larger or substantial market share. The other thing is that each transaction will be assessed on a case-by-case basis, focusing on the potential impact on the local market. Now let's move on to exemptions. So let's say a transaction actually meets the definition of economic concentration, meets the relevant thresholds. Now, is there a way that it would fall under an exemption? That way it doesn't trigger a merger control filing. Qatar, again, is unique currently with their competition law, and the competition law exempts state actions and institutions under the supervision of the states. The minister also has the right to exempt agreements that promote consumer welfare. Now, what you'll see here is that the usual exemptions for intra-group restructurings and perhaps some regulatory financial institutions are not actually included in the law. So that is unique to Qatar as well. Moving on to quickly the review process itself. Under the competition law, the committee has up to 90 days to investigate notified transactions issued and issue the resolution. In the event that the committee doesn't issue a decision within 90 days, then the transaction is automatically cleared at that point. I would say generally, I would estimate the process from submission to clearance would take between 45 and 60 days, which is similar to other GCC jurisdictions, with the exception of KSA Saudi, which has been recently this year less than 30 days. So they're overachievers there. Pre-notification discussions are not formally recognized under the framework of the law. However, due to our relationship with the regulator, we are able to sit down with them and have discussions on a no-name basis when we're authorized to do so. Now, recommendations. So seeing that you're looking at a law that's from 2006 that needs to be updated a little bit, right? But we don't have objective financial thresholds. We don't have objective market share thresholds. What you're looking at here is a very subjective standard that needs to be assessed and analyzed if you have a good chunk of the market share in Qatar, right? So my current recommendation for parties entering into a transaction with a Qatar market share equal to or greater than 25% or above is to obtain a merger control assessment. Due to the lack of objective thresholds, again, I would also recommend allowing us to approach the regulator on a no-name basis and informally just have discussions with them. And they are extremely great at that and having discussions and open with sitting down with us at any time. I would also note that both direct and indirect market shares are relevant for purposes of the assessment. Now, lastly, let's talk about potential predictions in the near future. I do anticipate the Qatar government to follow suit with the rest of the GCC and issue an updated competition law and new financial thresholds by the end of this year or the beginning of next year. I anticipate the same thing for Kuwait as well in terms of thresholds. Now, for Qatar, my hope is that this law will include a new definition of economic concentration, as well as multiple objective financial thresholds that must all be met. And I'm hoping one of those thresholds is a local financial thresholds. That way the nexus requirement is objectively visible for all to see. The new competition law should also include general restructuring exemptions and an exemption for no change of control to ensure that only the relevant transactions are captured. And finally, I would also like, and this might be unpopular with a lot of people, but I would also like them to establish a filing fee, because it seems that most parties take a jurisdiction more seriously if they have filing fees associated with their merger control filings.
It's interesting to see how everything is in flux and it changing and maturing and advancing. And it seems like Qatar is, kind of there in the same path that we saw the advancements and the changes in the competition laws in Saudi and Kuwait. So it seems like maybe in the next year or so, you're going to see a lot more similarities between the two. Would that be accurate?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
I said, with respect to the changes, it seems like it's in a pace of evolution. It's evolving. It's changing, and it's not there yet. You're filing now, but it's you see it more similar to the Kuwait and Saudi competition laws, say a year from today.
I do, and it's going to have to be, right? Because if you're capturing foreign-to-foreign transactions, and typically these foreign companies are used to a specific standard, not that standard just to meet that standard, but also the standard is there for a reason. The standard is there because it works. Now, what I would recommend is localizing that standard a bit via the thresholds, because everybody's markets are different. Qatar's market's a little bit smaller than for example, the UK market, or it's a bigger market like that. So they would need to tailor it a bit more. And the way to do that is to have multiple financial thresholds, or to have multiple types of relevant thresholds to the market, ensuring that the market is safe while at the same time keeping it open for business and saying, hey, we're still open for business. We don't want to be a hurdle in your way. So I see Qatar hopefully coming online via the trends that are happening in the GCC. It seems like everybody else has come online in the last 4 or 5 years. So I do anticipate them coming online just based off of that, with a new law, new thresholds, new exemptions that are on par with the rest of the GCC. And keep in mind, there is a draft GCC competition law that has been put on the table by Saudi. That's been sitting there for a couple of years now, but there may be something coming soon with respect to perhaps a unified competition law across the GCC. So keep your eyes open for that as well.
Okay, very interesting. Well, Jehan, I know, obviously being in the Qatar office, there's, and you working on the labor side, there's questions I would want to ask you. And it's questions that a lot of our clients ask when they're setting up shop or they have employees on the ground. It usually falls into 3 buckets. Number one, what are the labor law safeguards for local employees? Because across the Gulf, whether you're in Kuwait, Saudi, UAE, you're dealing with labor laws that are relatively pro-employee and offer protections and benefits that you don't see in other places, like end of service benefits and so forth. Second thing that we're seeing across the region is, the flip side of allowing companies to come in and being 100% foreign owners, say, yeah, come on in, set up shop. But we need you to hire a certain number of our local citizens, percentage. And every regime does it a little bit different. What's going on with Qatarization and with respect to that? Third thing, that clients will always ask is, tell me about, okay, if I can't find the local talent from local Qataris or the local expat force, how easy is it to bring in specific or specialized expat employees from various jurisdictions around the world? How would you respond to this smorgasbord of questions that I just asked? And clients will always ask the same ones as they set up.
Yeah, definitely. So the law number 12 of 2024 on the private sector Qatarization recently came out. Well, it's recently been put into effect. And this marks a significant step in the government's effort to increase national employment in Qatar. As you mentioned before, FDI has opened up in the country, and so this does balance that. Existing Qatarization initiatives have historically targeted key sectors such as energy, finance, and telecommunications. Prior to this law coming out, Qatarization was primarily pushed through policy directives and sector-specific strategies rather than this binding legislation that we're seeing now. For example, Qatar Energy has long maintained internal quotas for employing Qatari nationals. The Qatar Central Bank has also promoted Qatarization through licensed financial institutions, more through circulars and guidance rather than through statutory initiatives such as this one. The difference in these earlier efforts versus now is that there's enforcement and compliance before was often encouraged through licensing initiatives or even pressure rather than penalties or legal liability. As a result, there was Qatarization initiatives, but it wasn't as broadly implemented as it is now. So who does this law apply to and what is it? This law applies to private sector entities operating within Qatar, and it imposes new obligations to prioritize Qatar nationals for certain roles. The public sector quotas in Qatar are very high. They often require these sectors to employ 70 to 90% Qataris. These aren't new, but what's new is implementing these in the private sector. So currently, we have the law, but we don't have the executive regulations or anything following that describes what Qatarization is going to be in detail. There will be a scheme to classify employers based on their workforce size, job types, and other specific qualities. So this is going to work in a few ways. One, there's going to be hopefully an increased requirement in hiring Qataris, but it's not just hiring Qataris that's going to be implemented. There's also going to be training, employment, qualification, and scholarship programs. This is going to apply to Qatari nationals. And as a second level, children of Qatari women will also be considered in this Qatarization. So in incentivizing private entities to hire nationals, there will be a decision detailing the privileges and the incentives to the employers. We don't know what these incentives are yet, but when we find out, we will be posting on our LinkedIn. So there's also no threshold for the number and percentages of Qatari hires yet, and it may vary across sectors. This is something that we've seen across the region. We've seen in Kuwait, we've seen it in Saudi, we've seen it in the Emirates. Certain sectors will have different percentages of hiring locals. The difference is that Qatar is a much smaller jurisdiction than the rest of the countries I had just mentioned. So the thresholds might be much lower. There might not even be thresholds. It might just be process driven. We don't know the details to this yet. So what are the employer obligations under this law? Like if you're doing business in Qatar, this is something that you definitely have to keep in mind. So this law establishes a series of mandatory steps for employers to comply with the new national employment targets or process targets. First of all, private sector employees are now going to be under a legal obligation to formally notify the Ministry of Labor of all job openings within 1 month of these jobs becoming vacant, newly created, or available in any form. These postings should have like a description of the job, qualifications required to fill the role, proposed start dates, and salary offered. So this is going to be a statutory requirement. Another obligation as a private entity is to keep records, and we know that many companies are already doing this, so this is going to be a bit more specific. Because they're likely going to be hiring quotas for Qatari nationals, employers might be required to maybe maintain records of those hired, possibly submit annual reports or hiring plans that align with this new law. These are just projections, like we don't know exactly how this is going to be implemented, but we do know this will be looked at by the regulatory bodies. Obligations won't just be record keeping. As we mentioned earlier, there's going to be training and upskilling programs for the Qataris. And there is a possible priority to give Qataris certain, to be in certain job titles or in sectors. This is just following regional trends. This isn't something we've seen yet. So monitoring and enforcement. Non-compliance with this law is definitely going to expose companies to some regulatory and financial risk. The possible consequences like listed under this law are definitely fines, suspensions of licenses. There could possibly be restrictions on hiring future non-Qataris until they're compliant. We can see, again, across the region in Kuwait and in Saudi Arabia, that non-compliant companies face restrictions such as like bans on new work permits or even like license suspensions. So looking at this law, there may be similar things to come. The only difference with Qatar's penalties versus the rest of the region is that there is criminal liability for managers and corporate entities. This is if it's like due to gross negligence or things of this nature. We don't anticipate this being largely a big deal as long as entities are following the law with the job postings, with the record keeping, etc. So finally, we're just looking at the practical impact and the open issues that this law is going to have. As I had mentioned earlier, we don't have any of the details on this law until the regulations or any decisions come out. We don't know if there are going to be thresholds, if this is going to be, based off of the actual numbers of Qataris or just following the process. But we do know that companies should get ready now to start with the proper record keeping, to start looking at hiring locals. We don't know if small business enterprises are going to be treated differently. We don't know if targets are going to differ by industry. But we do know that there will be incentives in place for private entities to be in compliance.
Okay. Well, as they say, watch this space. It's an evolving area as well, and an important piece as foreign investors look to set up shop in Qatar. And, Dean, getting back to you and getting back to setting up shop, Qatar has been in the news a lot lately. In particular, I attended with you the recent Web Summit, which was very amazing in terms of the ecosystem that they're building, and the Qatar Economic Forum as well, which was held, I think, last week or the week before. In addition to the headlines, are there any actual legal and practical developments taking place in that technology / venture capital / private equity space? What would you say?
Yes, Alex, absolutely. There is a lot going on, both legally and practically. So just to get the sort of practical out of the way first, because it's what everybody's curious about. It's what everybody has been seeing in the news. There have been many venture capital sort of tech startup big names that have now entered the market in one legal form or another. A lot of this comes on the back of the recent fund of funds program launched by the QIA, the Qatar Investment Authority, which is the sovereign wealth fund here, one of the largest in the world. Since announcing that they've earmarked about $1 billion for VC funds, we've seen a lot of big names enter the market here. Some of those names include B Capital, Utopia, Builders VC, Human Capital, Deerfield. And then some of the other well-known VCs that are already operating here include Golden Gate, Alchemist Accelerator, Rosmal. So the VC space here is very active and growing, at a sort of exponential clip. And then in the more sort of traditional, private equity, asset manager, institutional investor space, we've also seen a couple of other very big names recently enter this market, names like Ashmore and Global Infrastructure Partners, which is part of the BlackRock Rook and the PE investment banks. Qatar is very active, and there are a lot of deal makers in town now. In terms of what we're seeing, we are seeing interest from both abroad and domestically, but largely abroad, in quite a few economic segments in Qatar. So we have been actively involved on some inbound M&A work in logistics, in the sort of sports industry, energy services, of course, and private schools as well. As the proud father of twins who have just started school recently, I can confirm that it appears these private schools are minting money. I would understand why foreign investors would be looking at investing in this space. In terms of actual legal developments, in addition, of course, to FDI opening up, and to that, obviously incentivizing foreign investors to invest in existing Qatari companies. The Qatar Financial Center, Omar's employer, recently issued a couple of years ago the professional investor fund rules. That legislation very much modernizes and opens up the doors for fund managers to consider setting up formal, legal, regulated funds in the QFC to fundraise from there and to use those entities to actually deploy capital and invest in startups, whether they're in here or elsewhere, whether they're early stage, whether they're mature companies. It really is, in my opinion, because we have actually worked with that legislation. I think that the QFC has created a very sort of pro-business, fund manager friendly legal regime. So we see that there's a lot of interest in setting up investment funds in the Qatar Financial Center and using those as a platform to invest. The other thing that I would mention, and again, this kind of ties back to FDI because obviously these two concepts are somewhat intertwined, is that this is a very wealthy country with a lot of opportunities. Some businesses that are doing very well. There's a lot of promise. The World Cup, even though it's in the rearview mirror now, was executed very successfully. A lot of the preparation has already been done. It's out of the way. So we have world-class infrastructure. We have world-class, roads and transport, and schools and hospitals, hotels, developments, places to live, places to work, and arguably the best airport in the world and the best airline in the world. So, the infrastructure is all there. The country is very investable, very livable. So whether it's foreign investors who are considering FDI, setting up anew, or foreign investors or local investors who are thinking of investing in existing businesses that they can hopefully improve and scale up, there's a lot of interest and a lot of activity in this space.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, having the fund laws there and having the fact that they can receive funding to set up their VC funds there is an amazing concept. Once they receive these funds, do you think they're looking solely at investments in Qatar, or is it more regional? How would you, are there restrictions where, if they're receiving the funding, where they can invest or not invest?
Well, I'm guessing that's, obviously very specific to each arrangement. The Sovereign Wealth Fund, of course, they'll have their own arrangements with each of the VC funds that they invest in. What we are seeing, however, in practice is that there are some, very promising, interesting sort of cutting edge technology startups that might not be fully based or fully, owned locally, but which have some kind of local nexus. So I think that this is a, very sort of understandable win-win situation for all parties involved. If there are some startups that were incorporated or owned not by people who are citizens or resident in Qatar, but which can maybe also set up shop in Qatar, employ some people here, develop some of their products here, test them out in the local market, then that's obviously a sort of natural synergy for all of the parties involved. And this is something that we've been seeing.
So that's part of the global race, it seems like, by every country and every government. How can they bring in that technology? What's the most efficient way of bringing know-how and technology to your country in this global race? And that seems to be a pretty efficient way. If you can have a ecosystem, you can provide some funding and develop a law and at the end present some opportunities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And for their part, we think that the Qatar Financial Center has done a lot in recent years to make this easier for investors, for fund managers, for all stakeholders involved.
Okay. Now, at this point, we'd like to look at some of the basic questions that have been asked, or, and I haven't gone through all of them. So what we normally do is we'll go through it. If we don't have time to answer during the now, we'll get back to you. Is there anything else before we sign off on any questions that anyone would like to answer, any statements that they'd like to make? Because for me, this is very enlightening myself. For someone who's spent over 3 decades in the region, I've put in a lot of time in Kuwait, UAE, and Saudi, and Qatar has always been what's going on there. It's a jurisdiction in and of itself, but it's interesting to see that it's kept pace and in some ways has surpassed some of the other jurisdictions in different areas. Just open it up to the team before we sign off in the next minute or two of anything of interest they'd like to say, with the caveat that any questions that we do see in the chat that we can get to, we will respond by email.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to say one thing because of this trend that I'm seeing in the region that is unfamiliar to foreign parties that have commercial activities in the region, right? The trend is coming late with respect to merger assessments, which then affect the closing of a transaction, right? I think not having competition laws on the books for a long time previous to the last 5 years, everybody got used to doing business in the region without having any concerns for any type of merger control filings in the GCC, plus Egypt. And mind you, Jordan even came online in 2023 as well. So they did business, they had their commercial activities, and there was no need to have any concern for these competition laws, even though some of these jurisdictions, in fact, did have competition laws, but they were not enforced. So it seems that the trend now is, okay, maybe now it's on the radar, but they're coming so late. And then when it comes to going through the process of preparing the notification, getting the legalized documents for parties that are not part of the Hague Convention that accept apostille, which takes time. Sometimes it could take 2 to 4 weeks to get these documents legalized. They need to be submitted with economic concentration filing. My main point to anybody that has a transaction with potential filings in the region is to come early, have an assessment done, put it as part of your, I'm sure you guys all have that big spreadsheet with the jurisdictions involved and yes or no, hey, we need to file, hey, we don't need to file. Include these jurisdictions after you've done your assessments, put it on your client's radar if you're not the direct client, and ensure that you take these jurisdictions into consideration because the enforcement has come. Many of these jurisdictions have sanctioned not only local, but also foreign parties. They have the ability to sanction foreign parties for not responding to their queries in the event they send out queries across the board. So keep this in mind. And, if you have any questions, obviously, feel free to reach out to us.
Alex, can I say one thing? Just following up on what Johan said. Just very quickly, she mentioned employment laws. I should have made clear that the laws of the Qatar Financial Center are all drafted in English. So for people who don't speak Arabic, for investors, westwards, Europe, United States, Canada, Australia, they all read very familiar. They read like a contained code that anybody used to practicing in the West will be very comfortable with.
Okay. Well, another investor-friendly aspect to doing business in Qatar. Wonderful. Well, look, Omar, I want to thank you for coming and attending. We enjoyed your presence. GLA team members, same thing. Thank you. And most importantly, for all our invitees, thank you for attending and stay in contact. And we will get back to you. And if you have further questions, just reach out and we're always there to give our 2 cents worth. Thank you for attending and take care.